It was a rainy and dark night when I was assigned to my first night delivery as a delivery assistant. The city where I live is small, and there is usually not much movement at night, which makes everything even quieter and more mysterious. I didn't bother with that, since I had made some deliveries during the day and was starting to get the hang of it. But that night, something seemed different. The package was intended for an apartment in an old building, one of those furthest from the city, with that dim lighting and noisy stairs, as if the place was trying to hide its secrets. When I arrived, I realized that the building was even darker than I imagined. The light at the entrance of the building flashed constantly, which gave an even stranger atmosphere to the environment. I went up the stairs, and when I got to the apartment door, I realized that it was ajar. The silence was heavy, as if the city itself was holding its breath. I rang the bell, but got no answer, so I decided to push the door slowly. The apartment was empty, with furniture covered with dust and no sign that someone lived there. The environment was too quiet, and a strange feeling began to take over me. I approached the window to check the recipient's location, which would give me some clue about where he could be. That's when, out of nowhere, a shadow moved quickly through the glass, reflected in the window glass. My body froze for a second, and a chill ran down my spine. I looked around, but there was no one there. I tried to ignore the uncomfortable feeling, and decided to leave the place immediately. My only intention now was to get out of there as soon as possible. I went back to the car, calling the company to report what had happened. While waiting for the call, a feeling of anguish enveloped me, as if someone was watching me. And that's when my phone rang again. It was an unknown call. I answered, and on the other side, a cold and strange voice informed me that the recipient had never placed the order. I was paralyzed. That didn't make sense. How could it be? I had the confirmation of the package. The address was correct. Before I could sue that, a police patrol showed up. They seemed to be already aware of what was happening and began to ask questions. I told what happened, but it seemed that nothing made sense. They said that the building had been abandoned for months, and there was no recent record of anyone living there. But the scariest thing was when they checked the security cameras. In the recording, I saw something that made my blood freeze. From inside the building, someone was watching me while I was at the window. The shadow reflected in the glass was not my imagination. That night, I returned home, but the feeling of being watched never left me. Even now, after all this time, I can't explain what happened. The building was empty, but something or someone was there, and it seemed to be waiting for me. And the strangest of all, I never received a single request for that address. I've always worked as a taxi driver at night in a big city, where the movement doesn't stop and the work never ends. On a rainy dawn, like so many others, I was waiting for a call at a remote point near quiet neighborhoods. The rain seemed to give no respite, and the empty and poorly lit streets made the weather even darker. When my radio beeped, I didn't think twice about accepting the request. The address was in a remote neighborhood, and the night was so quiet that I could barely hear the sounds of distant traffic. I thought it would be another trip without incidents, but I would soon realize that it would not be quite like that. I arrived at the indicated point, and soon a hooded man got into the car, without making many comments. His request was simple: leave me at this address. He seemed hurried, but you couldn't see much of his face because of the hood of his coat. What caught my attention, however, was the way he started asking me questions about my personal life. First, he asked if I lived alone. I was strange, but I answered without much interest, since it was a common question. But then he started questioning me about my work schedules, where I lived, how my family was, things he couldn't know. I felt a chill, but I kept calm, answering as little as possible. Something in those questions seemed wrong, as if he knew more than he should. The trip went silent for a while, only the sound of the rain hitting the glass and the roar of the engine breaking the silence. I was nervous, trying to focus on the road, but the strange weather wouldn't leave my head. The more I tried to ignore, the more the feeling of discomfort grew. The man seemed quiet, but from time to time he glanced at me through the rearview mirror, which made me even more restless. It was as if he was studying me, and I felt that something was very out of place, but I couldn't identify what. The surrounding streets were increasingly deserted, and I wondered what I was doing there, driving through those narrow and poorly lit roads, not really knowing where I was going. Suddenly, he asked me to stop on a very narrow street, with only a few buildings around, all looking abandoned. The darkness was complete, and the rain still fell hard, making everything even darker. The man didn't say anything when he went down. He just threw a business card in the back seat and disappeared into the darkness, without looking back. His behavior didn't make any sense. He got into the car without saying anything about the destination, asked those strange questions, and then simply left without a word of farewell. I took the card, which was soaked by the rain, and when I took a look, I saw that the name on it was completely unknown. I didn't want to know what was happening anymore, so I immediately went back to the taxi stand, still wondering what the hell that had been. When I got back to the taxi stand, the feeling of discomfort didn't leave me for a second. I was trying to get all that out of my head, telling myself that it was just another weird race, like so many others that happen at night, but something was not right. While I was parking, a policeman approached the car. He greeted me coldly, which made me feel a chill. Without warning, he asked if I was okay, as if he already knew something had happened. I confessed that I didn't understand any of that, and he asked me to get out of the car. That's when he asked me about the race, about the man, and I explained everything that happened. He listened carefully, but without showing much interest. But what made me cold was when he said that the address where I had left the passenger no longer existed. That place had been empty for years, no one lived there, no one even approached. And the name of the man on the card. He told me that the person who was registered in that name had mysteriously disappeared, without leaving a trace. The plug fell brutally. I had been involved in something much bigger than I imagined. He told me that he had no idea what really happened, but that they considered me as part of a simulated kidnapping scheme, something they couldn't explain. I felt an ice in my spine when I realized that I could have been a victim of something much more serious and planned, but everything happened so quickly that I couldn't even understand what I had experienced. I was there, standing in the rain, with a policeman explaining to me that something very wrong had happened, but no one knew exactly what. And the only thing that stayed in my head was the face of that hooded man, with his eyes fixed on me, as if he knew something I would never know. I've been working in a bakery for a few months, always on the night shift. My service usually involves serving customers and organizing the products, but that night, the usual delivery man was absent, and my boss asked me to make a quick delivery before closing. It was a simple request, a package with breads and sweets for a remote house, in a neighborhood where we rarely received orders. I thought it was strange, but I didn't question it. I took the address and left by car, without imagining that this would be one of the most terrifying nights of my life. The street was practically deserted, without lighting, and the thin rain made everything look even darker. When parking, I felt an immediate discomfort. The house didn't seem abandoned, but something in it made me uneasy. The curtains were slightly open, and I had the feeling that someone was watching me from the inside. I rang the bell and waited, but no one answered. I waited a few more seconds, and then noticed a motionless silhouette in the corner of one of the windows. My heart accelerated, but I tried to calm down. Maybe it was just the resident, hesitant to answer late at night. The feeling of being observed became stronger. I held the package more firmly and tried again. I rang the bell, knocked on the door, and even called loudly. Nothing. The silhouette on the window was still there, motionless. A chill ran down my spine, and I decided not to insist anymore. I put the order on the floor, right in front of the door, and turned to go back to the car. That's when I heard steps, slow, heavy, coming from behind me. My instinct screamed for me not to look, just to move on, but I couldn't. My body crashed for a second, and against all logic, I turned my head slightly back. I saw a shadow. Someone stopped near the house, in the darkest part of the backyard. I couldn't see the face, clothes, nothing, just the presence, as if it were a black hole in the darkness. My chest tightened, and before I could react, I heard a low, weak laugh, almost a whisper. I didn't expect anything else. I ran to the car, feeling my heart beating so hard that it looked like it was going to explode. My hands trembled as I looked for the keys in my apron pocket. I felt the shadow move behind me, but I didn't dare to look again. When I finally unlocked the car, I went in and slammed the door hard, locking everything immediately. I started the engine as fast as I could, and accelerated without even bothering to look through the rearview mirror. My only thought was to get out of there as soon as possible. I drove for a few minutes before allowing me to take a deep breath. My hands were still sweaty on the steering wheel, and my mind tried to rationalize what happened. Maybe it was just the resident of the house who had a problem. Maybe he was just playing with me. But then I remembered the laugh. It didn't seem normal. It seemed wrong. I can't explain. My chest was still heavy with that horrible feeling of danger. When I finally got home, I was still panting. I locked the door, checked the windows, and tried to calm down. But the fear was still with me. I sat on the couch and stayed there, processing everything. I took my cell phone and thought about calling someone, but who would believe me? It was late at night, and I had no proof of anything. Maybe I was just paranoid, maybe it was just a misunderstanding. But deep down, something told me that I had really escaped something much worse.